the information of members. Questions without notice. The Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister, and I refer to Nikki Savva's column today, titled "Prime Minister Scott Morrison, a cranky man in need of a plan," in which one of his own cabinet ministers says about the Prime Minister, "If you see a problem, walk away from it. If you see a problem, duck shove it to someone else." Doesn't this exactly describe the Prime Minister's approach to leadership? And didn't his own cabinet minister nail it?
Time has concluded. I call the Prime Minister.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. No.
And I call the member for North Sydney.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Will the Prime Minister outline to the House how those on the front line delivering COVID-19 vaccines, doing the essential work of transporting, distributing and administering them across the country, are helping to arm Australians against the virus so we can chart our way back from the COVID-19 pandemic?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for North Sydney for his question, and to all those members who've had to remain in their electorates, including the member for North Sydney. Thank you for the work that you're doing. Member for Bennelong, I was talking to last night, working in his community as well, and it's very important that we keep connecting Australians, particularly those who are going through lockdowns, whether now here in the ACT, New South Wales, Victoria, Mr Speaker, to the services and the support that is available to help them. Mr Speaker, this week 1/4 of all eligible Australians will be fully vaccinated. 1/4 this week, Mr Speaker. And next week, Mr Speaker, a half, 1 in 2 eligible Australians would have had their first dose. Mr Speaker, yesterday was another record day. 262,314 doses were administered in Australia yesterday, Mr Speaker. More than 100,000 of those doses, Mr Speaker, in New South Wales, and 2/3 of those delivered through the GP network, Mr Speaker, that is doing such an incredible job as the vaccination program continues to go forward and gather pace. Now, Mr Speaker, per capita, yesterday's result is equivalent to one of the top 10 days that the UK would have had across their entire vaccination program. Mr Speaker, this demonstrates that this program, Mr Speaker, is and has overcome the early difficulties to ensure that this program, Mr Speaker, is on track, and I want to congratulate General Fruin. I want to congratulate, Mr Speaker, all of those at the Health Department, Professor Murphy, Mr Speaker, the Minister for Health, and all of those who have worked together to turn this around, to overcome the early setbacks, which we've been very clear about, Mr Speaker, and get this program back on track. As I said this week, Mr Speaker, it's not how you start the race, Mr Speaker, it's how you finish the race that counts, Mr Speaker, and that is how we are approaching this task. Now, Mr Speaker, there are many others we must congratulate. Anthony Vass is a pharmacist out there running 3 Sydney practices, 3 pharmacies, is running night vaccination sessions at each, and they're staying open until midnight, Mr Speaker, to do that every night. Thank you to Anthony Vass. At the Wentworth Healthcare in the Blue Mountains, Nepean region, they put a call out to local registered nurses. In just 3 days, over 150 nurses answered that call, Mr Speaker. Down in the Higgins, Mr Speaker, they have delivered at the Star Health practices, Mr Speaker, 35,000 vaccine doses. And, Mr Speaker, at the City Medical Practice of Dr Sabrina Saldanas, they're doing 700 doses a week. Jodie Lyons is an electorate officer and the member for Wentworth's electorate, a nurse by training, stepped up by qualified to deliver COVID vaccines, is now doing 2 days a week at St Vincent's Hospital Vaccine Hub. Australians working together to get the country vaccinated, saving lives, saving livelihoods. Thank you.
And I call the member for Lilly.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Today, the Deputy Prime Minister said about the Prime Minister's refusal to act against the member for Dawson, "If you start prodding the bear, you're going to make the situation worse for us as a government, not better. I can assure you that when you've got a thin margin, don't start giving reasons for a by-election." What sort of Prime Minister puts his majority over public health in the middle of a pandemic?
I'm not sure that question's in order. I'm happy to hear The Manager of Opposition Business.
Yeah, thanks, Mr Speaker. To the point of order, the question goes directly to the responsibilities of the Prime Minister. The quote is from the Deputy Prime Minister, so in terms of the argument as to whether the Prime Minister needs to be across what everybody said, we're talking about the Deputy Prime Minister who's made these comments.
That wasn't my point, but go on. Yeah.
And goes directly to the statement from the Deputy Prime Minister saying that the reason for not speaking out against the member for Dawson is because of the slim majority on the floor of this House.
Well, look, I'll make this point. I will call it in order when it goes to certainly the point about, to form a government you need a majority on the floor of the House. But I do point out that it's a fairly broad question that may well certainly there's the opportunity for a broad answer, I have to say. Yes, sir. The Leader of the House.
Well, I think that the Prime Minister's position with respect to the member in question was made quite clear in the response to the motion that was moved yesterday.
Member for Morton will leave under 94A.
And just with respect to the question itself, the Leader of Opposition Business, in speaking to the point that the question is directly relevant, is being very generous in his understanding of the word direct, because the question is more of a musing than a question. It simply puts an opinion and then seeks an opinion on an opinion. And I don't actually see how, leaving aside relevance, it was actually a question.
Yeah, the Manager of Opposition Business.
Yeah, well, first of all, I thought that a ruling had been given, but if we're still if we're still on the previous point, the standing order rule about relevance goes to answers, not to questions. This question goes to responsibilities. There is, during a pandemic, a clear responsibility to speak out in favour of public health. The comments from the Deputy Prime Minister today say that that has effectively been compromised in order to preserve a majority on the floor. Now, the fact that the Prime Minister made some comments on... I might just
ask the Manager of Opposition Business to resume his seat. I certainly the question contained... Well, there was... I shouldn't say the question. The statement was longer than the question that was right at the end. And I am going to rule it in order, but I am going to make the point, and I'll reflect on this with other questions, that when a question is asked in that manner, that really is sort of political attack, accusation, and that's what it is. And there is the bit at the end is relevant. I'm going to allow it, but I will not be taking points of order on the Prime Minister not being relevant, because the way the question's been asked, it's almost impossible for him to be not relevant. The Prime Minister has the call.
2 days ago in this parliament there was unanimous support for a motion, Mr Speaker, that dealt with the issue of misinformation by members in this place. It was unanimous, Mr Speaker. Leave was granted by the government for that motion to be put forward, and that motion was supported by this entire parliament. And, Mr Speaker, I voted yes to that motion. That's what I did in this place, Mr Speaker. I voted yes to that motion, as did the members of the government, joining with the members of the opposition to send what I thought was a very clear signal on behalf of the whole parliament, Mr Speaker. So I find it somewhat disappointing that that mood of bipartisanship in addressing this issue, Mr Speaker, is now being sought to be undermined by the Labor Party only 2 days later. So what was that actually about, Mr Speaker? What was that about 2 days ago? Were we actually coming together to decry misinformation, Mr Speaker? Or was this just another political game from the Labor Party? What was it? I thought, Mr Speaker, as the Prime Minister, when asked whether leave would be given to bring such a motion, that this was an invitation for the parliament to come together and decry misinformation. That's what I understood. I engaged with the Leader of Government Business in the House and I said, yes, we should give leave to that. And, Mr Speaker, I spoke in favour of that motion. And in this place, Mr Speaker, in this place, we, as a group of elected officials, I thought, sent a very clear message against misinformation in this parliament. That's what I thought, Mr Speaker. But what we see today, not even 48 hours later, Mr Speaker, the Labor Party comes in here and even seeks to undermine the bipartisanship it sought to promote 2 days ago, Mr Speaker.
And the Leader of the Opposition, before I call him on a point of order, which I presume it is, I made it very clear in allowing this question that was very broad, that the answer may well be very broad, and I'm just now trying to save time. If it's on relevance, I'm ruling the point of order out of order.
Point of order.
The Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. It is on relevance.
There's no point of order. The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, but I've become quite accustomed to that behaviour from the opposition over the course of this pandemic. I have become quite accustomed, Mr Speaker, as Labor, even most recently, have been seeking to tear down JobKeeper, Mr Speaker. Tear down JobKeeper, one of the most important programs that has brought this country through, and Labor has said it's been a waste of money, Mr Speaker, that it's been a waste, Mr Speaker. On every occasion, Mr Speaker, what we have seen from the Labor Party through this pandemic is not a spirit of bipartisanship, Mr Speaker, but they have been a constant headwind to the efforts of this government to bring Australia through this, Mr Speaker. What Labor have been has been seeking to undermine, to put hurdles and obstacles in the way. And, Mr Speaker, we would invite them to take a different approach, but I am not optimistic about that because I have seen their form over the past 18 months.
The
now, Mr
Prime
Speaker,
Minister's time has
the
concluded. The Prime Minister's time has concluded. The member for Higgins.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Treasurer. Will the Treasurer update the House on how the Morrison government is working with the business community to support our economic recovery from the COVID-19 pandemic?
The Treasurer has the call.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for Higgins for a question to note her experience as a professor, as a paediatrician. She's published more scientific papers than I've published op-eds, Mr Speaker. No.
Gosh, not that many.
Sorry.
Not that many.
I knew the Prime Minister wouldn't believe that. I knew the Prime Minister wouldn't believe that. But, Mr Speaker, on a serious note, yesterday the people of Victoria got some very tough news with the extension of lockdown number 6 for an extra week. The people of the ACT today got some tough news with a lockdown for a week. And we are working with the business community, with the state and territory governments with respect to economic support. And today we have announced, in partnership with the Victorian government, a new support package of $367 billion for small and medium-sized businesses. Hairdressers, gyms, cafes, restaurants will all be eligible to receive payments that will range from $2,800 up to $20,000 for large hospitality venues. This brings to more than $1.1 billion that we have committed with the Victorian government in just the last 2 weeks to support small and medium-sized businesses. And I acknowledge the comments today from Victoria's Minister for Industry Support and Recovery, who said, "We are very grateful for the ongoing spirit of cooperation in which the Commonwealth is approaching the matter of business and income support, and it allows us to provide the package we are announcing today." And with respect to the ACT, both the Prime Minister and I have spoken to the Chief Minister today, and we are looking to provide support to businesses here in the ACT as well. Now, with respect to the partnership with the business community, we know that the banks have provided loan deferrals, and indeed, since the recent lockdowns began, an extra 15,000 home mortgages have had their deferrals. More than 1,000 business loans have also been deferred. And with respect to the vaccine rollout, General Fruin and I and the Chief Medical Officer met with senior business leaders to enlist them in our vaccination tasks. And we now have 2 of our major banks with pilot vaccination hubs in Sydney LGAs, Mr Speaker. And we also have Woolworths, Coles, Aldi and Metcash, who are providing vaccinations in partnership with the governments through those distribution centres, Mr Speaker. And we know that businesses have also been enlisted to encourage their staff and indeed their customers to get the vaccination. I was speaking to the CEO of Coles today, who has written to more than 110,000 of their staff, encouraging them to get the vaccination. So, Mr Speaker, this is again another Team Australia moment. Just as it was last year, it is again today. The Morrison government, state and territory governments working together with the business community.
The member for Newcastle.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Can the Prime Minister confirm that 11 residents and 3 staff at an aged care facility in Newcastle have been infected with COVID? The facility's chief executive says only 1/3 of staff have received even 1 dose of the vaccine. These workers were meant to be fully vaccinated by Easter. Who's the Prime Minister going to blame for this one?
The Minister for Health.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker, and I want to thank the member. I can confirm that the Royal Freemasons Hawkins Masonic Village in Edgeworth has had a series of COVID-positive cases. 11 COVID-positive residents have been transferred to John Hunter Hospital. Of these, 10 are fully vaccinated. All residents have been offered vaccination and 1 is sadly not vaccinated. And I would continue to urge around the country the family and friends of those who are in residential aged care facilities to provide the consent and to take up the opportunity, because it can literally save the lives of your friends and family members. In terms of the facility, 76 residents are fully vaccinated, of a total of 84 residents, although have been offered vaccination on a number of occasions. In terms of the staff, the figures I have are that there are 28 staff that have been fully vaccinated and a further 17 staff with 1 dose. In terms of the actions to support, the situation at this stage is that the residents have been transferred to hospital. PPE stocks have been reviewed and are considered to be adequate. There's an order for 5,000, however, that have been placed with the National Medical Stockpile. In addition to that, an infection control lead has been put in place. A deputised nurse practitioner has assumed that role, and they're getting assistance from the Commonwealth Government. In addition to that, workforce support has been activated through the Commonwealth Surge Workforce, and a request placed on the 10th of August for 2 additional RNs and 4 additional other nurses to assist with workforce on site. So these are the actions that have been taken. These are the actions that, importantly, have seen 76 of the residents fully vaccinated, of 84, and we would continue to urge and encourage all those family members who are speaking for residents to help get those last residents vaccinated. It's available and it can help save their lives and protect their lives.
And I call the member for Mayo.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Agriculture and Northern Australia. Minister, in 2018 the government released its Billion Trees for Jobs and Growth plan. Will the Minister please advise the House how many trees have been planted to date?
The Minister has the call.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker. I thank the member for her question and her interest, and understand the proud history in the timber industry, particularly King Island, which she represents, and the challenges it's also faced. We did announce our ambition to go towards those billion trees, and one of the biggest challenges that we have found subsequent to that has been the Black Summer events that have, in fact, displaced much of the industry, and making sure that we now plan strategically to support those areas that were impacted significantly around that with practical measures. And that's why our forestry hubs are being created, and listening to industry about how we achieve that, and also working with farmers. I'm proud to say that the NFF has also stood up and said that they wish to be part of this and part of the solution of how we continue to expand the timber industry. So we're now working as quickly as we can with local communities and the National Recovery and Resilience Agency, which used to be the bushfire agency, in making sure—
I'll interrupt the minister. He doesn't need to resume his seat, but the question was short and specific, and the minister needs to come to the specific part of the question.
Well, I will.
Yes, please.
And I am, because the reality was that that whole program was displaced because of the Black Summer events. As simple as that.
The member for Longman.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Health and Aged Care. Can the Minister please update the House on the real heroes of the COVID-19 pandemic who are testing and vaccinating a record number of Australians every day on the front line?
The Minister for Health and Aged Care.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker, and I want to thank the member for Longman and especially thank all of the nurses and doctors, the pathologists around Australia who have been taking action, whether it's through testing or whether it's through vaccination, to save and protect the lives of Australians over the course of the pandemic. A little while before question time, I actually spoke with Dr Evan Jones from the member for Longman's electorate. He is running the Morayfield Commonwealth Vaccination Clinic, and to this point in time they have delivered over 37,000 vaccinations. 200 staff are employed there. 140 of those have been employed to assist during the course of the Commonwealth Vaccination Clinic, and that includes 80 nurses that have been employed, 60 other staff that have been employed. And every one of those vaccinations is helping to protect a life and to protect others. Around Australia, though, this story is being told across the nation. As the Prime Minister mentioned, a record 262,000 vaccinations in the last 24 hours. In the last 2 days, over 500,000 vaccinations, or the population of Newcastle. In the last 3 days, over 730,000 vaccinations, or the population of the Gold Coast. And in the last 10 days—
Members for Patterson and Franklin will cease interjecting.
And in the last—
Say to the member for Franklin, the front bench is already thin enough. Okay. Well, I'll pass that on to those that have left. The minister has the call. The minister has the call.
And in the last 10 days, over 2,080,000, or approximately the population of Perth. These are the people who've been vaccinated. And those that are doing it, our nurses, our doctors, those that are testing, our pathologists and their assistants, are real heroes. In particular, I also spoke with Loretta Facey from the Hastings Medical Centre in my own electorate. Loretta and her fellow nurses and the doctors, she does say that the nurses have done the bulk of the work there, and at their counterpart facility, the Chelsea Heights Medical Centre, between them have done 15,000 vaccinations. Loretta Facey from the Hastings Medical Centre has done over 3,500 vaccinations alone. She's an Australian vaccination hero, but she is one of thousands and thousands of nurses and doctors at over 5,160 GP practices, along with our pharmacists who have done an extraordinary job. These people are saving lives and protecting lives in record numbers.
The member for Shortland.
My question is to the Prime Minister. I refer to the Prime Minister's statement in question time on Tuesday that, I quote, "Australia is the only country, to the best of our knowledge, that reports quarterly on its emissions reductions." Is the Prime Minister seriously telling the House he has no idea that the United Kingdom, New Zealand, Sweden and the Netherlands have published quarterly greenhouse gas emission statistics for years? Why does the Prime Minister keep making stuff up?
The Minister for Energy and Emissions Reduction.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. The point—
Members on my left.
The point the Prime Minister was making is that Australia has a track record of transparency that is unrivalled. Mr. Speaker, not only do we report our emissions each quarter. We report them across every gas and every sector. Every quarter, every gas, every sector, Mr Speaker. And I tell you what those reports are saying. Those reports are saying that our emissions are down by over 20% since 2005. Mr Speaker, over 20%, and that's head of the United States.
The
it's
Minister
head of
will
Japan.
resume his seat. The Manager of Opposition Business on a point of order.
On direct relevance, Mr Speaker, the question does not go to the details of anything being relevant because it found its way into these reports. It goes to the fact that the Prime Minister claimed that Australia was the only country, to his knowledge, that was doing this quarterly, and whether the Prime Minister that information was accurate or not.
Can I just say, I mean, there's another problem with that. I just say, with respect to the Manager of Opposition Business, he talks about what the question goes to. There was a question at the end that was really an accusation, right? And I'm not going to repeat it, but it was a very short. Member for Shortland. Most people asking questions want to stay to hear the answer. That's the purpose. So it had a long preamble with a question at the end that could have related to anything, frankly. So that's why I've been listening to the Minister. So I think...
On that respect, he's relevant to making him stuff up.
The Manager of Opposition Business will not abuse points of order like that, but in doing that, he has confirmed my ruling. The Minister's in order.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker. And as I was saying, Australia's emissions are down 20%, as you'll see in our transparent reporting, every quarter, every gas, every sector, Mr Speaker. And you'll see in those reports that in the last year alone, our national electricity market emissions are down over 5%, Mr Speaker. That's in a single year. And the reason for that is very clear, Mr Speaker. We have the highest level of installed solar capacity in the world. We have 7 gigawatts that was installed in the last year alone. That's more than in the entire time, the entire 6 years when Labor was in government, Mr Speaker. And the year before, if you look at our transparent reports, the year before, again, a single year more installation than the entire time when Labor was in government, Mr Speaker. And that's because we are focused on technology as a means of driving down emissions. Indeed, when those opposite left government, Mr Speaker, their forecasts were for emissions that were expected to be over 100 million tonnes higher than we actually had last year, Mr Speaker. Now, we will continue to drive the transparency and the outcomes that I've just described, because that is the Australian way, Mr Speaker, but we will do it without taxes. We will do it without wiping out industries. We will do it without wiping out regions, Mr Speaker. We will do it the Australian way, through innovation, through ingenuity, through $20 billion, Mr Speaker, of investment in technology, clean technology that's going to continue to drive down emissions. And our transparency, Mr Speaker, our transparency will ensure that the world can see what an extraordinary job we continue to do, as we have been doing for many, many years.
And I call the member for Mallee.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Agriculture and Northern Australia. Will the Minister please outline to the House how the Morrison-Joyce government's significant investment in infrastructure not only supports our Ag 2030 plan, but has helped regional Australia as we recover from COVID-19?
The Minister for Agriculture and Northern Australia.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. And I thank the member for Mallee for her question and acknowledge that she represents one of the richest agricultural regions in the country and proudest regions in the country. And despite droughts, but also COVID, our regions have got a renaissance, not only because of rain, but because of the infrastructure and environment that we as a federal government are backing them with. And that's over $110 billion worth of infrastructure projects, over 20,000 projects right across Australia, many of which are in regional Australia, empowering them to continue to be the powerhouse of our national economy. And it is part of our Ag 2030 plan. It's one of the key pillars of our Ag 2030 plan. And part of that is not only about putting roads and rail and airports, but also about water infrastructure. $1.6 billion has been committed and started to be spent in over $3 billion worth of projects in building dams and plumbing this country, building capacity in not only the agricultural sector but supplying water supply, critical water supply, to many of our regional communities. And this is about infrastructure like the Emu Swamp Dam in Stanthorpe that will not only grow horticulture in Stanthorpe, but also supply Stanthorpe with critical water that they've been missing for so long. Or the Rookwood Weir, in which the member for Capricornia fought so hard for to secure. They'll bring new agricultural jobs and supply water for those townships across central Queensland. But it's also about diversifying the economic base. $1.2 billion into our Building Better Regions Fund, $607 million under our Stronger Communities program, which is about diversifying the economic base, letting these economies diversify, not just relying on agriculture and resources, but looking into new ones, into tourism and going further through supply chains to create more jobs and give greater strength in times of hardship, whether they be drought or fire or flood, so their economies are more resilient. We're also making sure that we're connecting our people with the rest of the world and our product with the rest of the world. And that's about the road infrastructure, $3.5 billion worth of roads of strategic importance, making sure that we're connecting the paddock to the ports, getting our product out, be able to support the free trade agreements that this government has put in place and continue to negotiate. It's also about the roads that we're putting right across this country, connecting this country and opening it up, the Outback Way from Winton to Laverton, Winton in Queensland across to Laverton in Western Australia. They'll open up mining, it'll open up agriculture and it'll open up tourism as Australians are starting to awaken to the real travel opportunities that are here in Australia. So this is the environment and infrastructure that our government is investing in regional Australia, not just to help them through the tough times of drought and fire and flood and COVID-19, but to take them to the next level to continue to be the economic powerhouse of this nation.
The Manager of Opposition Business.
Thanks, Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Effective public health communication in a pandemic is essential. Can the Prime Minister confirm that translations of vital Commonwealth Government COVID information in languages other than English are almost 2 months out of date? 18 months into the pandemic, who is the Prime Minister going to blame for this?
Yeah, exactly.
Members on my left, the Minister for Health has the call. The member for Cowan will cease interjecting. The Minister has the call.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. And one of the things that the government has done throughout the course of the pandemic is to engage early and on a continuous basis with people from culturally and linguistically diverse communities. We have a cold communication working group which has been operating for much of the pandemic that has been engaged in ensuring that materials are provided to cold communities. That includes constant work to update materials as they are available. It also includes radio and television advertisements, materials that are made available. These are updated on a continuous basis, and we work in particular with communities to ensure that the language used is accurate. That includes we are working with social media, television. We're working with advertising. We're working on multiple different fronts to ensure that messages are provided to the culturally and linguistically diverse communities from around Australia, and those are updated as quickly as they can be. But most importantly, one thing that is very significant here, the engagement that we have had across those communities with numerous activities in terms of community fora, meetings, engagement with leaders, working directly through those leadership groups, and as the member knows from his own electorate, working with religious leaders, working with social leaders, with community leaders from all of the different cultural and linguistically diverse groups, also providing direct references to state facilities and state information sites which are updated on a constant basis, as well with relevant local materials. And so these are the things that we've done. We are so thankful to our cultural and linguistically diverse communities for the work that they have done. Right now in Southwest Sydney, we are continuing to work with them to ensure that their role in leadership, in encouraging vaccination, is seeing people both stay at home, be tested and to step forward for vaccination, and we are beginning to see real and powerful results on that front.
The member for Menzies.
Mr Speaker, I ask the Minister for Defence Industry if she would update the House on how the men and women of the Australian Defence Forces continue to offer vital support to the Morrison government's response to the COVID-19 pandemic, especially through Operation COVID Assist.
The Minister representing the Minister for Defence.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and can I thank the member for Menzies for his question and acknowledge the incredible support that he has given to the men and women of the ADF, especially during his very long tenure in this place. Mr Speaker, right across the nation through COVID, Assist Defence personnel are playing an essential role to support our response to COVID-19, and since March last year, some 20,000 ADF personnel have been deployed right across our nation, with more than 1,750 currently being deployed across Australia. In New South Wales, Mr Speaker, we see the ADF are supporting a variety of activities, including home engagement activities and also contact tracing. And we know from people on the ground, Mr Speaker, that the ADF's involvement has been extremely welcomed by local communities. There is no doubt, Mr Speaker, that seeing our men and women in uniform on the ground in communities gives us all an enormous lift. In Victoria, Mr Speaker, ADF support continues, with over 400 ADF personnel helping out the Victorian authorities with such activities like hotel quarantine and also home engagement activities. And of course, Mr Speaker, the ADF stands ready to support the ACT should that help be required. With respect to the vaccination rollout, Mr Speaker, up until May this year, the ADF had administered some 6,800 COVID vaccine in aged and disability care facilities, playing an important role to make sure that our most vulnerable Australians receive their much-needed vaccines. Mr Speaker, from a defence industry perspective, this afternoon I spoke with the Deputy Secretary of my department, who's in charge of the Defence COVID-19 Industry Support Cell, Mr Tony Fraser, to ensure that the Defence Support Cell is now gearing up to expand its support to defence industry here in ACT, just like we have provided to defence industry in Victoria and New South Wales more recently. This support cell has been in operation since March 2020, and, Mr Speaker, it's played an incredibly important role during COVID to make sure that Australian businesses can continue to provide the very essential services but also equipment that our ADF needs. Mr Speaker, this cell stands ready to assist and support with border crossing for essential personnel and the delivery of equipment and supply, and also access to workplaces for essential workers right across the country. So I'd like to encourage defence industry here in ACT. If you do need assistance, please make sure that you reach out to the Defence Industry Support Cell. Mr Speaker, I know I can speak on behalf of every member of this House to say how proud we are of the men and women in uniform who are doing an outstanding job helping our nation through these difficult times, but I'd also like to acknowledge those people in the Department of Defence who are also playing a critical role as well.
The Leader of the Opposition on indulgence.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. I join with the government in thanking the men and women in uniform who are assisting on the ground, and I thank the Defence Minister as well for going out of his way, for example, to provide a Defence Force person to be a part of Zoom calls taking place with leaders in the community so as to assure them of the role of the Defence Force and make things certainly much better on the ground.
The member for Werriwa.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. People in my electorate of Werriwa are in their 7th week of homeschooling their children while trying to do their own full-time jobs, and they have no idea when it'll end. Isn't it true this wouldn't be happening if the Prime Minister had done his 2 jobs on vaccines and quarantine? Australia are paying the price for the Prime Minister's neglect. Who is he going to blame this time?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. As I said last week,
Anyone who thinks a Prime Minister only has 2 jobs doesn't understand what the job of the Prime Minister is, Mr Speaker. The job of the Prime Minister, of course, addresses the urgent crises we're dealing with over the course of the pandemic, but it also deals with the national security issues the country is facing on a daily basis, Mr Speaker, were it not also for the economy and the importance of getting Australians back into jobs, Mr Speaker, the delivery of important services and education and health all around the country. And in particular, only last week, Mr Speaker, the important work we were able to conclude in bringing together the Closing the Gap implementation plan, so much championed by the Minister for Indigenous Australians, Mr Speaker. This country has many, many challenges, and it's our government's job, Mr Speaker, to address all of those, including the big challenges of the COVID-19 pandemic. And as a result of the government's actions working together with Australians all around this country, we know that Australia has one of the lowest fatality rates of COVID-19 in the world, Mr Speaker. And in addition to that, we know that after the COVID-19 recession last year, more than 1 million Australians have found their way back into jobs. And that is now under threat again because of the Delta variant, Mr Speaker, of this virus, which has been an absolute game changer for the COVID response. And that has meant in countries that have vaccination rates higher than Australia, whether in Europe, Mr Speaker, particularly in the Netherlands, or in Singapore, Mr Speaker, or in Japan, or in other countries, where they have sought to open up, Mr Speaker, the Delta variant has had a very different view. And it would be mistaken if anyone in this place or elsewhere was to underestimate the impact of the Delta variant in how countries all around the world are dealing with this challenge. But that's why I'm encouraged by my fellow Sydney-siders and those across New South Wales, Mr Speaker, who are dealing with the most difficult current lockdown. And yes, we want to see our kids back in school. I want to see my kids back in school. My kids are homeschooling like those of other parents across New South Wales in this chamber, Mr Speaker, in Sydney and also in Victoria, Mr Speaker, wherever they happen to be. We want to see our kids back in school, but we want to see our communities safe, and we want to see the right response in place to ensure that we can suppress the number of COVID cases that are there in New South Wales right now. And that's why the lockdown is so necessary, and the lockdown has to be effective. Suppress and vaccinate. That, Mr Speaker, is the phase we are in, and the next phase is part of the national plan that we have brought all of the country alongside with, Mr Speaker, including all of the state and territory premiers and chief ministers. And we are making progress against that plan. As I said, 1 in 4 Australians this week will be eligible Australians will be fully vaccinated. Next week, Mr Speaker, 1 in 2, and we need to continue that pace. Another record day, 260,000 and more, Mr Speaker, 260,000 and more of vaccines that have been delivered, and predominantly by the GPs, Mr Speaker.
The Prime Minister's time has concluded. I give the call to the member for Robertson.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and my question is to the Minister for Education and Youth. Will the Minister update the House on how the Morrison government is supporting young Australians through COVID-19, particularly those students who are sitting their final year exams?
The Minister has the call.
For Robertson for her question and her incredible support that she provides to young people and indeed all people in the Central Coast there in New South Wales. Mr Speaker, as I think all members of this House are aware, that young Australians have been doing it pretty tough during this pandemic. Today, there's close to 1 million people who should be, 1 million students that should be at school who are learning from home. In the last couple of months, 6 state and territories have had to close down schools for a period of a week or more, and with the ACT it will become 7. My home city of Melbourne, school kids have lost close to half a year of face-to-face schooling now. This has been a very tough time for those students, Mr Speaker, and I particularly feel for those Year 12 students who are facing exams coming up. And I want to reassure them that if they need the mental health support that they may require, then that is there for them. Because during this pandemic we provided an extra $500 million to support those people who have mental health concerns. And much of that money, Mr Speaker, has gone to those youth-oriented mental health services, including fantastic organisations like Headspace, which are targeted at 12 to 25-year-olds. So I encourage young people to reach out to there. But know also that they'll be getting special consideration in their Year 12 exams, at least in New South Wales and Victoria. So have that hope as well. But, Mr Speaker, my general message to young people is that they should have absolute hope and optimism in the future, because I can tell you what, when they graduate from Year 12 this year, the opportunities which they will have will be as great as ever been had before. Because, Mr Speaker, from a job perspective, our unemployment rate for young people is now the lowest in 12 years. In university places, never has there been more. In relation to training and apprenticeship, we're putting billions of dollars in, so there's more of those opportunities there, Mr Speaker. They should be optimistic and positive about the future, as we are in this House, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, I want to finish just by thanking all of the young people for the resilience which they have shown during this pandemic, for seeing this through and for putting their arms around each other, because ultimately that's one of the most important things that they can do. And I want them to know that we are thinking about them as we go through this pandemic, ensuring that the economy is strong, ensuring that those mental health supports are there, ensuring that those opportunities are there for them to go to university, for training, for jobs, Mr Speaker. The future is great for those young people. I'm very proud of them, as I know everybody is in this chamber.
The Chief Opposition Whip.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. People in my electorate of Fowler who have been attending churches, mosques and temples every week for most of their lives have not been able to go for at least 7 weeks of this year. Isn't it true this wouldn't have happened if the Prime Minister had done his 2 jobs, vaccines and quarantine? Australians are paying the price for the Prime Minister's neglect. Who is he going to blame this time?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker. It is difficult that you can't get to your place of worship and to be able to pray, whatever your faith might be, and I note and acknowledge the faith of the member, which is well known to me, Mr Speaker. It is difficult because those of us of faith draw great comfort from it, from being able to pray with others and to be able to pray for each other and to do that together, and to come together in a place of worship and to sing our worship and our songs. As some of us like to do it in one way, others do it in different ways. However you like to worship, good for you, because it's good for the soul. It's good for the spirit. And I want to thank all the pastors and the priests and the ministers, Mr Speaker, around the country, the imams, Mr Speaker, and rabbis, Mr Speaker, right across the priests of whatever faith, who are out there encouraging those in their congregations and praying for them and giving support, and all of those working in those faith groups who are providing those supports on telephone trees, talking to them about vaccination, encouraging them. Mr Speaker, I particularly want to thank the Pacific Island faith leaders who have been fantastic in getting messages into their communities about the importance of vaccinations. Because this is a Team Australia moment, Mr Speaker. This is a time when Australians come together and support each other and get the job done for all Australians, Mr Speaker. It is not a time for undermining. It is not a time for cheap politics, Mr Speaker. It is not a time for that type of partisanship, Mr Speaker. It is a time to focus on the job ahead and for all Australians to get behind that effort, Mr Speaker. Because I note, Mr Speaker, even those countries like the United Kingdom, Mr Speaker, with a vaccination rate which is over 70% now, the death rate in the United Kingdom, Speaker, right now is 104 every day. 104 daily. Now, I know where I'd rather be, Mr Speaker. I know where Australians would rather be. They'd rather be in a country that has been able, over the course of this pandemic, to be able to save more than 30,000 lives and get 1 million people back into work, Mr Speaker. That's what we've been seeking to do, working with governments all around the country, from whatever political persuasion. But it does disappoint me that the only bipartisanship I can find in this pandemic comes from the state and territory leaders, not from that which sits opposite.
The member for Braddon.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Home Affairs. Will the Minister please update the House on how our law enforcement and Border Force staff are working on our front line to keep our borders secure and Australians safe through the COVID-19 pandemic?
The Minister for Home Affairs.
Well, I thank the member for his question, and I'm delighted to be able to stand here today and congratulate the Australian Border Force, the Australian Federal Police, ASIO, many of the agencies that have been on the front line in this pandemic and, quite frankly, have done an outstanding job. Now, at the start of the pandemic, this government made some very decisive action, took some very decisive steps in relation to our border, and without a doubt that has gone a long way to keeping us safe and secure here and to reducing the transmission of COVID-19 right across our community. But of course we would all understand here that managing our borders in these particularly difficult times is a major logistical effort, and the brave men and women of the Australian Border Force and the Australian Federal Police in particular have done a fantastic job, not only managing people who are coming across our borders through our ports and our seaports, but also managing the significant increases that they've had to deal with in terms of the cargo. They've also done some fantastic things like facilitating the PPE that we needed very early in the COVID-19 pandemic, and they've also done work, particularly recently, making sure that the vaccines are facilitated through our airports so that they can get to where they need to be. So I do thank them for their work. And as I said earlier, I do congratulate and thank the AFP on their work, and I congratulate our intelligence agencies on the work that they have done, because whilst we are all dealing with the COVID pandemic, they continue to deal with some fairly serious threats like terrorism, organised crime and extremism, and they have taken on new and different forms during the course of the pandemic. And as a government, we are making sure that they are being given the resources and the legislative backing that they need to be able to do their jobs. Now, as we've seen recently, some ideologically motivated extremist groups are using the pandemic to whip up some community fear and spread a great deal of misinformation. We will, as a government, remain very vigilant to this and to the potential toward incitement to violence in any form of ideology, no matter where it sits on the political spectrum. Now, where necessary and appropriate, our law enforcement agencies will take appropriate action. And it was only recently that there was an incident where the Federal Police took very swift action in relation to particular individuals impersonating the AFP in an online video. So I thank them for their work. I thank the Australian Border Force, I thank the Australian Federal Police, and I thank our intelligence agencies.
The member for Macquarie.
Thank you, Speaker. My question's to the Prime Minister. Small businesses in my electorate of Macquarie are struggling to keep their doors open, this time without any JobKeeper. They don't know how much longer they can go on. Isn't it true this wouldn't be happening if the Prime Minister had done his two jobs on vaccines and quarantine? Australians are paying the price for this Prime Minister's neglect. Who is he going to blame this time?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker. The support that is being provided to New South Wales right now. Now, the member opposite may not be familiar with how JobKeeper worked, Mr Speaker, and I say that because JobKeeper provided payments to businesses to make payments to their employees, Mr Speaker, and those payments were $750, Mr Speaker. That's what JobKeeper did. JobKeeper made payments to companies so companies could make payments to their employees. JobKeeper was designed to be an income support mechanism to individuals paid through companies. And I can tell you, Mr Speaker, that in New South Wales, so far, we have made payments of $1.7 billion in income supports directly to people, Mr Speaker, who have been working in those same businesses. Mr Speaker, who may have been getting supported by JobKeeper in the first iteration of that, Mr Speaker. And in addition to that, I can tell you that across that workforce, some 743,624 people in New South Wales have been receiving that direct income support from the federal government through the COVID disaster assistance payment. Now, 502,000 of those are and I should say 655,000 of those are in Sydney and Greater Sydney. Some 87,390 more, Mr Speaker, are across New South Wales where they have been receiving that support. And not only have they received it once, Mr Speaker, they keep receiving it each and every week. And I want to thank the staff at Services Australia, who in the first waves of the pandemic did an extraordinary job in ensuring they were supporting people who were needing income support and other benefit support to get them through those first two waves of the COVID-19 pandemic. But I can tell you, Mr Speaker, the staff at Services Australia have backed up again because the delivery of the COVID disaster assistance payment to those individuals, which includes many, many thousands of sole operators that we know, Mr Speaker, have decided to avail themselves of the COVID disaster assistance payment rather than the New South Wales Business Payment Program, which we are supporting on a 50-50 basis with the New South Wales Government, which is being delivered by the New South Wales Government to businesses across New South Wales, with a turnover from $75,000 a year to $250 million a year, with payments of $1,500 a week through to $100,000 a week. So the combination of the cash flow support with the income support coming together is providing the same support that was provided previously, but in a more targeted way to assist those people. Now, the member opposite interjects, and she says it's not working, Mr Speaker. Well, I don't know what's not working about payments that are being made within 30 minutes of people making applications. And it's a further evidence, Mr Speaker, those opposite could encourage their constituents to avail themselves rather than undermine.
And I call the member for Lindsay.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Employment, Workforce, Skills, Small and Family Business. Will the Minister please update the House on how the Morrison government is supporting Australians through the COVID-19 pandemic by delivering essential government services?
The Minister for Employment.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. Can I thank the member for her question? We know in the current circumstances of the pandemic it's very difficult for many Australians, and can I acknowledge the member for her hard work she's doing in her electorate right now, especially with the Nepean Hospital outbreak. Mr Speaker, our government, through our service delivery agencies, will continue to support Australians as we make our way through the pandemic. As the House would be aware, the Morrison government introduced the COVID disaster payment the Prime Minister was just referring to, and it's been activated across numerous LGAs across Australia. A payment of $450 if you've lost between 8 and 20 hours of work a week, or $750 if you've lost more than 20 hours a week. And of course, we're backing in aspirational Australians. And those Australians who are on a welfare payment but are still getting work and part-time work, if they have lost over 8 hours a week, there's an extra $200 for them as well. Services Australia, as the House would know, was established by the Prime Minister as one of his first priorities when forming government to ensure a dedicated agency for service delivery, and that agency has been stumping up. Services Australia has been ensuring over 320 of their service centres right across the country have been open right through the pandemic, right from the very start last year, seeing over 30,000 Australians every single day whilst other workplaces have been closed. Services Australia have mobilised enormous amounts of staff, 600 new staff, 250 more APS staff, 4,000 internal staff moving from other roles, joining 13,000 other staff. They've taken over 400,000 calls seeking financial support since the 8th of June, and as at today, a staggering 1,192,000 Australians have received the COVID disaster payment the Prime Minister put in place. 743,000 in New South Wales, 243,000 Australians in Victoria, 78,000 in South Australia and 127,000 in Queensland, including over 30,000 Australians in my hometown of the Gold Coast. Many Australians are now receiving that recurrent payment because the Prime Minister said they don't need to do anything. The payment will keep rolling over. Indeed, 1.8 million of those payments have gone out and a staggering $2.1 billion in direct support to Australians that are in need. Extraordinary numbers, But as everyone knows in the House, behind every number is a person, it's a family, it's a story. The Morrison government will continue to stump up and stand beside Australians by providing these supports. And for Australians in need, simply go to MyGov. You'll be able to claim online. And as the Prime Minister has said, in so many instances, you'll be paid within minutes. And that payment will be recurring as the government stands beside you in some very difficult times.
The member for Shortland.
My question is to the Prime Minister, and I refer to reports of the Prime Minister's verbal spat with the New South Wales Treasurer over his inadequate financial support for the people of New South Wales. When is the Prime Minister going to stop swearing at Treasurers and blaming others for his failures and do his two jobs on vaccines and quarantine?
The very last part of the question's in order. The Prime Minister has the call.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker. What the Australian government has done, together with the New South Wales government, is delivering support to businesses in New South Wales that is urgently needed as they work through this pandemic. And, Mr Speaker, we've been working closely with the New South Wales government to achieve that. And I'm very pleased that we were able to come to those arrangements, not just on one occasion, Mr Speaker, but upgrade those arrangements and the work that was done between the Treasurer and I and the Premier of New South Wales and the New South Wales Treasurer. Because what matters, Mr Speaker, is that we get this support to those people who need it. I've just mentioned the significant support that has been provided through the COVID disaster assistance payment in New South Wales, Mr Speaker, that has resulted in $1.7 billion of support going to people who have lost hours, more than 8 hours, not just more than 20 hours, Mr Speaker, but more than 8 hours, including those who are on benefit payments, which was the last issue of improvement that we made to those COVID disaster payments after we were working together with the New South Wales government. And increasingly, as the New South Wales government ensures that those payments are being made to New South Wales businesses, that's going to help them come through this current lockdown and be able to get to the other side. Because one thing I know, and I know it because we saw it last year, when we came back from the COVID-19 recession, when we got to the point where we were able to graduate the Australian economy off JobKeeper. And I remember those opposite are hoping and are praying, Mr Speaker, that 100,000 people would still be out of a job, and they were proved wrong. They were proved wrong, Mr Speaker, and those results did not happen as they were trying to doomingly protect.
The Prime Minister will resume his seat. The Manager of Opposition Business on a point of order.
On reflections on members. Last week, no one from this side raised a point of order about the state of the Deputy Prime Minister when he stood at that dispatch box. The allegations
the
that
Manager
the Prime
of
Minister
Opposition
wants to
Business
make
will
here—
resume his seat. The Manager of Opposition Business will resume his seat. The Leader of the House has the call.
That's obviously meant to be some sort of personal reflection which has to come in another form. That really is beneath the Manager of Opposition Business. It really is.
The Manager of Opposition Business will cease interjecting, and I will just make the point that the reason question time gets to this robust state is because some of the questions carry some pretty heavy character assessments in them as well. So, and in allowing and encouraging free speech, I allow it on the basis that it allows, once that question's been asked, it actually allows the responder to respond to the issue without the accusation simply standing there. And I do object to members reflecting on each other in that way, and I've always made the point that if a member has a problem with the conduct of another member, they need to raise it with me or in the House, and no one has. The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. So, while those opposite have sought to undermine the government, Mr Speaker, to talk down the programs that we've put in place, like JobKeeper, Mr Speaker, and distance themselves and call it a waste, Mr Speaker, undermine the government's efforts as we've sought to deal with the significant challenges we've had in the early phase of the vaccination program, which we have now turned around, Mr Speaker, which we have now turned around thanks to the magnificent efforts of those working in Australian public service, Mr Speaker, and under General Freeland's leadership, but more important, those on the ground working in the vaccination clinics, in the vaccination hubs. And today, throughout question time, Mr Speaker, our government has been thanking Australians for the work that they have done. Exactly right. The work that they have done to get Australia on track, because those Australians know that they want Australia to succeed, Mr Speaker. They want Australia to succeed. They want these programs to succeed because they know that that is the path back. We have set out the national plan which sets out that path for Australians to be able to make their way back and through this COVID pandemic, Mr Speaker. And we will continue on. We will continue on that path, Mr Speaker, whether the opposition wants to support us or not.
The member for Nichols.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Regional Health. Will the Minister please update the House on the action the Morrison-Joyce government is taking to ensure that millions of Australians living in regional, rural and remote Australia have access to high-quality medical workforce and the health services they require?
The Minister for Regional Health has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I'd like to thank the honourable members for his question and compliment his service to the good people of Nichols. Not only has he delivered roads and bridges and railways and water infrastructure, he is delivering one of the new end-to-end rural medical schools in Shepparton, and he was there at the forefront of the planning for that some years ago. When I first entered Parliament in 2013, there were only 749 doctors enrolled in the general practice training program around the country. That has basically doubled to now 1,427 in the last year. We have had a targeted rural health strategy to expand the number of medical, nursing, dental, pharmacies and allied health professionals working around the country, and we are delivering on that pathway and strategy. In the last 2 years, there's been 700 additional general practitioners and 700 additional registered nurses delivered into regional, rural and remote areas. There was an extra, that was a $550 million plan. There's $123 million in the last budgetary cycle to expand training and workforce incentives. Workforce incentives in a geographically based fashion give a bulk billing incentive. To the more regional and remote you go, the greater the incentive. And that was another $65 million in the last budget. The Rural Health Multidisciplinary Training Program that supports 21 university schools of rural health and rural medical schools is now expanded to 21 sites. We've delivered 26 regional training hubs with subsidies for 1,000 specialist training spots to increase the specialty training pipeline for regional Australia. We've supported the Australian College of Rural and Remote Medicine with a dedicated national rural generalist pathway. We have incentivised junior doctors to get out of hospitals early and experience general practice in regional Australia. In fact, 50% of the general practice training places are now dedicated to being trained in regional and rural Australias. As well as this, there have been many reforms, like the Telehealth Initiative, that has been instrumental in keeping general practice and treatment and advice available to doctors to treat their patients by telehealth. We've expanded regional radiotherapy services around the country to break the tyranny of distance and make sure people get access to training. So across the board.
So the Minister's time has concluded. I call the member for Scullin.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. The Auditor-General's Office found that a top 20 marginal seat list was used to identify projects to be funded under the commuter car park program and, I quote, "some of the canvassing was done out of the PMO." Will the Prime Minister table the list that was used by his office?
The Minister has the call.
Well, I do thank the member for his question. And again, I make the point that the decisions made by the minister were within authority. Our government is committed to delivering commuter car parks. Just in the last couple of weeks, the Ferny Grove has commenced and Revesby in New South Wales has commenced. In fact, under the commuter car park or under the Urban Congestion Fund, 177 packages of work, of which 69 have now been commenced or completed, Mr Speaker. So we're getting on with delivering the Commuter Car Park Fund and the Urban Congestion Fund. And of course I make the point, Mr Speaker, that the Labor Party is not clear as to whether they support commuter car parks or whether they oppose commuter car parks, because they took to the last election a park and ride fund which involves support for commuter car parks at Mango Hill, Gosford, Woy Woy, Panania, Hurstville, Mandurah, Riverwood, Frankston.
Seat. The member for Scullin. The
point.
Yes.
I am searching for relevance,
but
I'm not having the same challenge that the minister does.
The member for Scullin better come to his point of order.
Thank you. Point of order on relevance. There was no, the question was a very narrow one. Very difficult to see how he can answer it, actually. But certainly this is not within the scope of the question.
Yeah, I was just about to intervene on the minister. It was a specific question that it went to the ANO. You can resume your seats. Okay. Went to the audit report and then asked one specific question. So I think the minister needs to just bring himself back to the question or resume his seat.
From Auditor General's report, which says, quotes, "This worksheet summarises the distribution of funding on a party political basis as well as in geographic terms." Close quote. ANA report number 3, 2010-11, regarding the regional and local community.
So to the minister, you put one over me the other day, but you're not going to keep doing it. The member for Ford.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Indigenous Australians. Will the minister please update the House on how the Morrison government is supporting the COVID-19 vaccination rollout in Indigenous communities and the importance of working in partnership with our Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people?
The Minister for Indigenous Australians.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and thank you to the member for Ford for your ongoing interest in this area, but also your long-standing friendship. As of this morning, more than 160,000 Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, nearly 30%, have received one dose. 14%, or 80,371, have received a second dose. And whilst we need to increase the vaccination rates, it is steadily progressing forward. On the weekend, I watched a particular episode on television to do with Warnham in my own state of WA. 80% of residents were vaccinated in 2 days, supported by the leadership of Gidja woman, Dr Catherine Engelkleck. What she said was having transparency of information from a team that they trust certainly made a difference. That they can also see people haven't had reactions to the vaccination. We are using 15 to 17 languages through Aboriginal media to get stories out there. In the Torres Strait Islander region, 67% of the eligible population has received one dose and 41% have had 2 doses. Palm Island, which is dealing with tough issues, have vaccinated 1,172 of the 4,000 residents. Here in Canberra today, I know that Julie Tong at Woononga will be standing up the Aboriginal Community Controlled Health Service to ensure that the vaccination levels she has achieved will continue to be implemented in this region to ensure that people are protected. What's more important is we are working with communities. At MeWatch in the Northern Territory, the health workers went out around the community along with the doctor, talking to families to ensure that they felt comfortable and they could be trusted in delivering the vaccines. It is absolutely critical, and what's been tremendous is the work that is being done across government and across the community to achieve these outcomes. I was talking with General Fruin yesterday morning about some of the strategies that he's doing in order to build that partnership with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people across this nation so we can increase those vaccination rates. Luckily, we've had no deaths. Even with the numbers that have been affected by COVID, which is around 200, we have not seen them hospitalised. So there is a resilience to some extent. But it's a remarkable achievement when you consider the status of health conditions of many Indigenous Australians. So we'll continue to work in partnership to implement the program, and I also acknowledge my colleague, the Minister for Health, for the work that he is doing in partnership with me. Thank you.
The Prime Minister.
Mr Speaker, I ask that further questions be placed on the notice paper.
And the Prime Minister